Have you ever felt like life is different from what most people think? And that in some way it hides something from us? Because at least when I was a kid, not much time ago, I'd, I'd like to, I like to wonder about those things, and I like to wonder about why things are the way they actually are, and how these function. And I know that at first might sound like something like a momentary revolt from a kid whose parents wouldn't let him play video games all night long. But now that I think about it, I don't think that's exactly the case. You see, what happened back then is I'd sit at the left back seat of a car, which is my personal favorite. I'd look out the window and I'd think about this kind of stuff, about why society worked the way it did, and if by any means we were being used for some bigger purpose. And at the time, I didn't have the knowledge about how information is achieved by people. So I want you to take a quick look at this sentence right here. Something is being hidden from us. And I want you to remember this sentence, and especially the word something, because we're going to need it later. And I know that at this point, you might be wondering, well, what kind of 15-year-old boy wearing a pink shirt and a pair of blue socks possibly tell me about things like reality and the true meaning of life? And it's okay, I really don't judge you for that, because I know it seems kind of unlikely. Although, let me see if I'm able to change your mind until the end of this presentation. So, just to make it clear, when I say something is being hidden from us, I don't necessarily mean something big or even concrete, to be honest. So, for example, governmental plans about Third World War, or even, who knows, Illuminati taking over Congo and trying to destroy the world. No, none of that. My point here has to do with the process people have to go through in order to achieve information. And in order to understand this process, we have to go back in time a little bit. And especially, and most importantly, to a period of time in which neither did the media, as we know it today, nor the internet exist. So, there's one question here. Back then, how did people even communicate with each other? How did information propagate? So obviously, depending on what period of time you chose, your answer might be different, right? So let's consider some examples. Firstly, the Roman people, when the Roman Empire was still a thing. Back then, how did people communicate with each other? So what would happen is the emperor or whoever was in charge of doing the task would communicate publicly with the people in order to tell them what was going on outside the empire. So, for example, external relations with other empires, or perhaps even issues that were meant to be tackled inside the own empire. Another example, the Portuguese in the 16th century, when they discovered America. How did they relate the stuff they discovered in America? How did they give the information to the people back in Portugal, in Europe? So in this situation, which is very similar to the Roman one, what happened is either would they send letters back to Portugal relating what they'd seen and learned, or they would go back themselves and tell them what happened. And lastly, an example from not so much time ago, the Second World War. So back then, how did people even communicate with each other? What would happen is, if a commander by any means wanted to send specific information to another commander who was in charge of another battalion, what he would do is either would he rely on the information, on the technology that was available at the time, which depending on which side of the war you were was different, or he would choose a specific group of soldiers to go in the direction of that battalion and tell them personally what the commander firstly wanted to say. And what do all of these means of communication have in common? Well, if you compare them to the ways of communication we have today, they're all incredibly slow and inefficient, which brings us to my first point, which is velocity of information. And yes, you might be wondering, well, but how can velocity of information possibly harm anyone or society in any way? Well, the thing is, considering the incredibly short amount of time it takes for information to be generated and afterwards propagated nowadays, we create a system in which we simply feel overwhelmed by the amount of information we receive every second. So for example, today, if I want to acknowledge information that has just been generated in the other side of the globe, it only takes a device with internet connection and 3 quick touches on its screen. And there I am reading about Putin's last measures on COVID measures on Russia. And yes, this might still seem like something not very dangerous at all. But the thing is, if you join this point with my next point, you might agree with me when I say that this might generate a situation we don't really want to be in. And this next point are the ways of propagating information we utilize like this. And this is a very interesting and curious point because until some time ago, let's say 30, 40 years ago, the most important and influential ways of communication were newspapers, magazines, journals, television, and then of course radio. And what happened back then is that the companies that owned the most important and influential portals of information, they realized that if they wanted to beat their rivalry, they would have to sell the information they already sold. They would have to do that at any cost, which meant that if they had to sell fake news in order to achieve profit, they wouldn't hesitate, right? Now, don't get me wrong, fake news was not invented or first used in the 80s. Although the seriousness of the situation and its percentage of use increased considerably when its main purpose began being this competitiveness between these companies. And the thing is, if you combine these 2 points, I believe we might reach a point in which what is real and what isn't doesn't necessarily matter anymore. Because think with me, if even the people who are responsible for generating and propagating information to the rest of the population don't have an actual reason for caring about the truthfulness of that information, well, I believe we are in a situation in which they simply don't know what is real and what isn't anymore. Because they have no reason to care. Because the only thing that matters in their minds is if the information is actually interesting enough to make us spend more and more of our time on their products. And apart from that, there are companies such as Google, Instagram, and Facebook that have certain algorithms in their programs. And these algorithms, they work in a very simple way. So firstly, they gather information about the user, they try to understand what certain information might interest the user to the point that he'll spend more and more time of his day on the product. And after that information is gathered, they start sending you more information that is related to what they chose. So that information generally comes via ads, right? And the problem with this process is that firstly, this whole process occurs without your consent, right? So you don't really have to search for that information for you to achieve it. And the other problem is that they don't care if the information that you're being sold is actually even healthy or useful for your life at all. So to prove my point, the other day I was searching a way I could try to show you guys how this algorithm works. And I ended up going to my dad, who's probably watching right now, and I told him to open up his Google search and type in, "What are the election results?" And then I told him to print his screen and show me the possible results and suggestions Google gave him to complete a sentence. And afterwards, I went to my personal device and did the exact same thing. So as we can see, in the left image, in my search, there were results like, were the election results certified in Michigan, are the election results in, and are the election results final? And in the other hand, in my father's research, there's stuff like, what were the election results in 2015? What were the election results in Canada? And what were the election results? And this is very funny because we're able to see how the algorithm makes it possible so that devices who belong to people who see and live with each other every day generate different suggestions of completion to the same sentence. This is something very, very interesting to me. And all of this brings us to my last point, which is what I call the big muscle memory. Since none of my Google researches told me about absolutely anything that had used the name before, so I had to take it for myself, right? And we all know muscle memory, right? That's the capability human beings have to acquire motor tasks through repetition. So you do something once, then you do it twice, then the third time, and then the fourth time, you might be able to do whatever it is that you're doing without really thinking about it, because your brain is already used to the process of doing that certain thing. But how can this relate to everything I've said until now? And why is its name so similar to the muscle memory? So firstly, is because I believe human beings have this sort of DNA integrated thing, in which throughout time, when it is proven that a behavior is unnecessary to your body, it will simply be erased. And yes, you could technically call it evolution. But since in this case, there's no actual evolution going on at all, I'd rather just use this term because it describes the situation better. And the thing is, if you combine the 3 points I've told you this far, I truly believe there's people right now who are kind of living in what I call a vicious bubble. A vicious bubble is an imaginary place in which, since the algorithm chooses what the information you receive, and this information always aligns with your personal interests, you start living in a world in which you always think you're correct because the information you always receive aligns with what you think. And the problem with that is that if people start acquiring the same behavior, we might be in a situation in which next generations might not even be capable of questioning themselves if what they hear every day is true, because there won't be such a thing in the reality, right? And I don't know if you guys remember, but at the beginning of my presentation, I told you to remember this sentence right here. Something is being hidden from us. And I told you to specifically remember about the word something and its meaning. And to be very, very fair with you guys, I would love to be able to share its meaning with you. But the thing is, I don't think there's an actual meaning for this word. I think it's a symbol of, in each specific case of each specific individual, what he loses and what he stops acquiring once they let themselves be vulnerable to what the internet and what the media can do with their head. And I know this might not seem like the most exciting way to end a TED Talk, because presenting no actual solution to a problem is not very, very nice. Although, if it matters that much for you guys, I'm going to do my best at giving you a quick tip. If you really want to know the meaning of this something in your life, try to learn the truth. Try asking questions like, how do you know this is real? How do you know this isn't real? And how do you get to that conclusion? And then see what happens. So my part here has been done. Now it's up to you. Thank you very much.